We've got two fantastic speakers for this premiere session of the morning. The first is Sir Mark Walport, who is currently the Chief Executive of UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, previously Government Chief Scientific Advisor and Director of the Wellcome Trust, so brilliantly placed to talk about the future of research. We also have Magdalena Skipper, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Nature, the prestigious international science journal, weekly, and by training a geneticist. So what we're going to do, we have half an hour. What we're going to do is each of them will say a few words to start off, their own reflections on the future of research, the next 10 years, what we need to do. And then I'll moderate a conversation between them. And then after a half hour, we'll move on to some Q&As in the separate breakout room. So I'd like to start by inviting Mark, if you would, to give some reflections.
So thank you very much indeed, Claire. So before we start on the future of research, maybe we should just look briefly at the past of research. It's easy to forget that the public funding of research is a 20th century phenomenon. And it very much emerged from warfare, where the need for science, engineering and technology became paramount. So the UK research councils, the forebearers of UK research innovation, emerged from the First World War, and their shape was determined by a report on the machinery of government in 1918 by Lord Haldane from what was then the Ministry of Reconstruction. And then, of course, in the Second World War, science became even more important, and the foundation of the National Science Foundation in the US followed the wartime work of Vannevar Bush and his extraordinary 1945 report to the President, Science, the Endless Frontier. But it's fair to say that in both cases, Haldane and Bush recognized that fundamental discovery research was absolutely essential to underpin the applied work. And moving right to the present, the very fact that we've been able to sequence the SARS-2 virus within a small number of weeks of its emergence, and to be already well advanced in the difficult task of making a vaccine, is really only possible because of people who studied the mechanisms of heredity, diversity, the science of life. And they were just curious to work out how we work. So we are in another emergency, a different sort of emergency to warfare, COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there's nothing new to pandemics. Plagues and pestilence have a very, very long history. But this, of course, is an acute emergency on top of a series of other emergencies going at various pace, almost all of which are driven by human demography. So the fact that we have 7.5 billion people on the planet, we have aging populations in some parts of the world, young populations in other, the effects on the planet and on other species of our demands for resources and the associated waste and pollution that we produce, responsible for climate change, environmental degradation. And then associated with this, we're going through a huge technological revolution in which obviously information technology and the subject of this online conference is a really important part, AI. And I think all of these changes are associated with increasing social unrest, which is associated with a rise in populism, a rising perception of inequalities that are becoming more and more apparent and widely recognized in many cases to be unfair. And these changes are going along with skepticism about what researchers and many innovators are fundamental values, the values of science, the methods of science, the values of the Western Enlightenment. And truth is being confounded by fake truth, fake news. And this, of course, is an area where AI can be deployed on both sides. So I think it's fair to say that science, engineering, technology, social science, the arts and the humanities are responsible for our success as a species. And now I think we need to use all of these to prevent us driving ourselves, together with many other species, over a cliff. So the next 10 years is a critical time for researchers, and we must individually and collectively help to tackle the problems faced by society. But we must also recognize that researchers and the research enterprise is in and of itself a microcosm of society, with all of the strengths, the weaknesses, and the foibles that go with us as human, social, and I fear sometimes antisocial beings. So I would argue that I don't think we can go back to the old normal after this pandemic subsides. There's too much opportunity for change and too many huge challenges that face us. And I think that almost all researchers would acknowledge now that research is pretty much a team activity. It's frequently multidisciplinary, but the challenge is that employment and promotion incentives still largely favour individual rather than group achievement. Publish or perish still dominates, funding is enormously competitive, and all of this creates incentives for bad behaviour and sloppy research. But we should also recognise that the public purse, represented by governments, by politicians, by treasurers around the world, is not simply interested in buying the paper or indeed its citations. What we want as taxpayers is health, well-being, resilience and security. And for all of these, we need a good economy. All of this can be supported, and I would argue is essential to be supported by research and the associated innovation. But none of us should make any mistake. It's the impacts of research and innovation that matters to the holders of the public research and innovation personally. So it's what happens to the research and to the researchers that matters. Researchers who leave the bench, the library, or the computer to contribute to other walks of life are at least as important as those who remain as researchers. And as we remember that Black Lives Matter, this is a moment not simply to reflect, but to act on the equality, diversity, and inclusion issues that plague the research effort around the world. But one thing, however, that will not change is that research is all about asking questions. And the answers to those questions can be turned by engineers and technologists into assets that can change the world and human lives for better or for worse, and those of other species with which we share our planet. And the art of great research is asking and answering the great question. And a common characteristic of great research environments is mentorship for researchers throughout their careers in framing research questions well. And finally, AI itself, it's a powerful technology. And like any other technology, it's neither good nor bad. It's the individual application that needs to be judged. And I think we need to examine AI through several lenses. There's obviously the research to develop AI further. There's AI as a powerful tool to help to conduct research. There's research on the effects of AI applications. And indeed, ultimately, just as human cognition is the greatest unsolved challenge in human biology, so it may turn out that understanding the outputs of AI may in and of itself prove extraordinarily challenging. So Denis Gabor, the Imperial College scientist and engineer who won the Nobel Prize for the invention of holography, wrote a book called Inventing the Future in 1963. We badly need to invent a better future for humanity and other species. And time is not on our side. In the context of CogX, how will we use AI as part of that better future? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's always particularly interesting to come at questions about the future by looking back into the past and then moving forward. Magdalena, your reflections on the future, or indeed the past.
Thank you. So it will be a bit of a mixture, although my focus will mainly be on the future. And I will frame my reflections around 3 points. It's really gratifying for me to see that really each of the points that I will make harks back to something that Mark has already said. And I hope all of you will appreciate how the points that I'm making amplify some of the key messages. So from my perspective, getting the next 10 years right in research, first and foremost, will depend on increasing the diversity of those who are included and involved in research. So to look back in the past for a second, I want to illustrate it with a very simple example. If you imagine being asked to imagine a scientist, most of us will instantly conjure up an image of an Einstein lookalike figure. Of course, a male, a white male. And indeed, throughout the history of science, the research and the questions in science have been predominantly asked by men who are white. It has had important consequences. Just think of a few examples. In biomedical research, as well as social sciences, women and people of color have been excluded from the focus of research questions. This has, of course, meant that, for example, in the context of medicine and drug development, where drugs are mainly tested on, or used to be mainly tested on, white male volunteers, lo and behold, we have found that these drugs are less efficacious for women in many cases, and for people of other ethnicity. Often they have side effects which previously would have been unseen in these tests. So research in the future needs to be inclusive, diverse, and equitable, so that we can ask better and increasingly more relevant questions, that we can better understand ourselves, but also importantly the world around us, and that we can find better and more appropriate, more inclusive solutions to our global problems. You know, Mark spoke about asking better questions and framing questions in a better way. And so what I would suggest is that we will not be framing questions in the right way or asking the right questions until the research community itself is diverse. This brings me to my second point, and that's the need to focus research in the future on the strive for sustainability. So in the past, we have often seen science research being done in the ivory tower institution, sometimes seen as detached from the daily life, blue sky, or academic. Now, lest I be misunderstood, let me just clarify. I absolutely value blue sky research. I think it's essential, and actually Mark gave some very important examples of how initially blue sky research can lead to very important practical future applications. But just consider the term academic. In everyday common parlance, often academic means not relevant to everyday life. Where I'm going with this is that in this academic setting of research, often the impact of academic output is focused in this own academic setting. So it's measured within the academic context. For example, it's most often measured as citations to papers that scientists publish, and now increasingly to social media scores. But arguably, the greatest impact, of course, would be the impact on real life. So thinking about research in the next 10 years, I would hope that we bring a greater focus on more tangible way of measuring impact of science, how it impacts the lives of real people, but not just through advances of medicine, but also, for example, through finding sustainable solutions to the food crisis, which incidentally is exacerbated by the current coronavirus pandemic, to the balance between urban and wildlife habitats, to considering the impact on maintaining biodiversity, on reversing effects of climate change, and so on and so on. Mark spoke about science moving beyond the pandemic, beyond the current situation, and indeed many have called already for the green rebooting of the economy, and this is a fantastic focus for research over the next 10 years. And incidentally, the 10 years framing fits perfectly within the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which wrap up in 2030, of course. And so my third and final point also relates to science beyond the pandemic, and focuses on the legacy of the pandemic in the science, the way that science and research is done, but also is disseminated. So what I'm referring to here is the increasing flexibility and speed and openness around research, which we've particularly seen in the context of COVID-19 research, but done in a way that all the while preserves integrity of the research process. So let me tease out a couple of points here. So just as I spoke earlier about science being more equitable in terms of opportunity for a diverse group of researchers, science and research more broadly should be more equitable in terms of opportunities for all researchers, all of us, to use and reuse data and other research findings. So these findings not only should be open to reuse and build on those who created or generated them in the first place, but of course these research findings should be rapidly disseminated. In the current situation of the pandemic, it's been especially important, and it's been, from my perspective as an editor of a journal, tremendously encouraging to see how the research community has worked together to rapidly share the information and the findings. One example that Mark already gave that I was going to bring up myself is indeed the speed with which the agent of the current pandemic has been identified and its genome sequenced. If you compare this, what happened in the most recent SARS epidemic a few years ago, this time has been dramatically contracted. And that's because of so much more openness and so much more international collaboration. And that's definitely when the next 10 years should focus on: much greater openness of this outcome of research, much greater collaboration, international collaboration. And the one other final point now that I want to make is how this openness links with transparency of research, and how this is not just important for research itself, but how research is perceived by the general public. Trust in science or research is associated with understanding how science is done, not exclusively, but this is an important component, how research is done, how researchers discuss amongst themselves and consider the outcome of the investigation. And look, for example, what's been happening in the current pandemic. Science has been ever present on the news, in the media, every hour on the hour, essentially over the last few years, in a way that I can't remember that it happened last time. And in general, the trust in public has increased as this has unfolded. So this openness, transparency, continued communication in the next 10 years of science, I feel as crucial, and I very much hope to see that going forward.
Thank you. Thank you both. So there's a lot of big themes in that, in what you've said. Given where we are this morning, can I ask you in the remaining few minutes just to think, or to talk a little about how you think AI will change or will help to respond to some of the challenges that you've mentioned? How might it affect openness and transparency? How might it change who can be brought into the conversations and who can ask the questions? How might it change the questions that are asked in research? Magdalena, coming back to you for a moment, what difference, or how do you think AI can help, or what effects might it have?
So, even though I didn't specifically refer to AI as a discipline, research discipline within my few minutes of reflection, of course, each and every point that I made applies to AI itself, just as it does to other disciplines. But let me pick up on one point to begin with specifically. It is well known, especially to this audience, that there's been a lot of discussion around issues of diversity and potential bias in AI, or specifically machine learning approaches. And in general, the thinking is shaped around three sort of streams, or three axes, if you like. That there is, of course, bias in data, there is bias in algorithms themselves, but there's also bias in the people behind AI. And the community itself, I believe, is aware of the issues and is trying to tackle each one of them separately, but also in combination. In the end, they, of course, come together. It's something that actually I would really love the audience to comment on. I know this may not be possible given the current setup, but I would love to know from those who are much closer to this discipline how they hope that this particular conundrum is going to be resolved. There is an interesting possibility to consider that we, of course, know that all of us humans carry our own biases. Many of them we're not aware of. The interesting question to my mind is, can AI be better at this, be more free of these biases in a way that surpasses our own limitations?
Thank you. Mark?
So, I mean, obviously AI has the potential to make the sort of tsunami, the huge volume of research findings, more intelligible. But it's entirely how AI is used. It's an enormously powerful tool. It can undoubtedly be used for benefit in the scientific sphere. But as Magdalena's indicated, it also has the potential to perpetuate biases. It's a technology. It can be used well, it can be used badly. And I think that this is a really critical issue because people talk a lot about trust. Trust depends on behavior in a trustworthy fashion. And so it's how the people that code AI, or codes itself to some extent now, ensure as far as possible that it's trustworthy and people use it in a responsible way. So I think there's a great burden on the community. And whilst it's easy to say, well, the technology is neutral, nevertheless, those that develop it, those that are interested have a responsibility, I think, to behave in a trustworthy fashion.
So both trust and trustworthy behaviour and aspects of diversity come back often to discussions about culture and research culture. In the last few minutes, could I just ask you briefly both to say, what do you think leaders should do to engender the kinds of cultures that are both trustworthy and enable inclusivity and diversity?
Well, maybe I'll have a brief go at that. I mean, so firstly, obviously, leaders have to behave themselves in trustworthy fashions. And then I think that leaders have to use the levers at their disposal to try and work on to make it a better culture. So research funders need to look at their funding to make sure that it encourages the best sort of cultural practices, if I put it that way. So it's about recruitment, it's about using peer review in the best way. It's about recognizing all of the issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion. But it's about giving people time as well. So if you make a short grant, the pressures to achieve results quickly, I think, provide perverse incentives. So it's about giving people the space and the time and making sure that they're in environments that can enable them to ask good research questions and answer them in the best way. If you're in a university, then it's how you employ employment practices. And Magdalena can comment on what journals can do because they have an important role. So I think for leaders, it's their own behaviours coupled with using the levers at their disposal.
So I would add to this, I guess I would start by saying, from the perspective of diversity, I think for the leaders, it's incredibly important to listen to the communities they want to include. Diverse communities need to be supported and given space to express themselves, and in this way to lead, if you like, reverse leadership, lead the leaders themselves. For example, many of you will know tomorrow there is a movement, Strike for Black Lives, particularly focusing on STEM disciplines, asking researchers, academics, educators to pause for one day to reflect on how this whole community can support Black researchers and Black lives in particular. So it's just one example of how we should be creating space. So Mark called me out about how journals and publishers can do this. And indeed, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we can be more inclusive and at once lead, but also follow the lead of others in terms of where the research community is going and where it should be going. So it's a mixture of activity, I think.
Thank you. We've got some fascinating questions coming up for the breakout session, I think. So if you had kind of one message for research leaders at every level in AI, what would you be asking them to focus on? Mark. I know it's tough.
Well, I mean, the answer is that, of course, you have to focus on the practicalities, and so it depends what their role in AI is. But it's actually, I think it really is thinking about the uses of AI and looking at it through a sort of lens of social responsibility. I think that's going to be incredibly important.
Yep. Thank you. Magdalena?
For me, I think it's going to be transparency. There is a lot of there's a deep lack of understanding outside this community how machine learning approaches work and the threat that can come from AI. So I think transparency of approaches is for me the key point.
Thank you very much. So as I say, we've got some really interesting questions on a wide range of the things that you've talked about coming up. Charlie, do we move to the breakout room?
Absolutely. Claire, thank you very much for hosting that session. What an interesting conversation. Thank you, Sir Mark, and thank you, Magdalena.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.